Welcome back, my dear listeners, to Voices of Fear. Throughout history, people have believed that the greatest dangers come from far away, haunted forests, cursed temples, desolate roads. But sometimes, the real terror lives right next door. Across cultures, neighbors have been both protectors and threats. Those who watch over your home, or those who watch you. And when their secrets come out, they can be more horrifying than any ghost story. Tonight, we bring you 3 chilling, true tales of neighborly horror. Encounters that prove evil doesn't always knock at your door. Sometimes it shares your walls. But before we begin, viewer discretion is advised. Some of what you're about to hear may disturb you. In nearly every culture, there are warnings about neighbors. In Japanese folklore, the zashiki warashi, childlike spirits, were said to live in homes, sometimes as unseen neighbors, bringing fortune or ruin, depending on how they were treated. In Europe, whispers told of witches living among villagers, neighbors by day, spellcasters by night. And in modern times, psychology has a term: the dangerous neighbor. Ordinary people who harbor obsessions, grudges, or dark secrets, until one day, the mask slips. Tonight's 3 stories blur the line between folklore and reality. You'll hear of shadows moving in walls, of neighbors who weren't truly alive, and of a family who discovered too late that the horror was living just beyond their fence. Each story reminds us of a truth no one wants to face. Sometimes, the most dangerous hauntings come from next door. Story 1, The Neighbor in the Walls. Our first story comes from the United States, told on a true crime forum in 2012 by a man who swore that every word was true. He had just moved into a modest apartment building, the kind of place where the walls are paper thin. You could hear your neighbors sneeze, argue, even whisper. At first, it was just a nuisance. Late-night footsteps upstairs, the faint rhythm of someone tapping a pen against a desk, a soft humming that drifted through the vents. He told himself it was normal, just city living. But then, the sounds began to change. The humming grew into whispers. At first, faint, like someone murmuring in another room, then clearer, words half-formed, conversations that didn't make sense. He swore he heard a voice say, "Stay quiet, don't let them know." His skin crawled. Weeks passed, and the noises followed him from room to room. Sometimes, when he was eating dinner, he'd hear a laugh behind the wall. Other times, lying in bed, he'd hear fingers dragging along the plaster, slow, deliberate scratches, as though someone was tracing his movements. One night, he woke at exactly 3 a.m. The apartment was silent, except for a sound that froze him where he lay, breathing. Not his own. Deep, labored, coming from inside the wall next to his bed, inhaling, exhaling, heart pounding. He pressed his ear against the plaster. The breathing grew louder, slower. He held his breath, terrified. And that's when it stopped. Dead silence. It was as if whatever was inside the wall knew he was listening. Well, convinced he was losing his mind, he confronted his landlord the next morning. But instead of brushing it off, the landlord's face went pale. His voice dropped, and he admitted something that made the tenant's stomach turn. Years earlier, another tenant, a man, had lived in that same unit. He was strange, obsessive, always keeping to himself. When neighbors complained of missing food, missing objects, the police were called. They broke into his apartment and discovered something no one was prepared for. Behind his walls were crawl spaces, Narrow tunnels carved through the structure, holes drilled into corners of rooms. The man had been living inside the walls, sneaking out only at night, watching his neighbors through hidden cracks, listening to them, breathing behind their walls. And then he died there, alone, his body discovered only after the stench seeped through the building. The new tenant sat in silence as the landlord told the story. His blood turned to ice because the noises hadn't stopped. They were happening now. Night after night, the scratching returned, the whispers, the breathing. He lasted 6 months before breaking his lease and leaving everything behind. But here's the most disturbing part. The apartment is still occupied today, and tenants years later still complain of the same things. Whispers at night, scratches in the walls, breathing when no one else is home. So the question remains, is it the ghost of the man who once crawled through those passages? Or is something else still living inside the walls? Story 2, The Woman in the Window. Our second story takes us to Delhi, India, a city where old traditions stand shoulder to shoulder with modern life. Streets packed with vendors, families gathered in courtyards, and neighborhoods where the buildings are so close that your neighbor's window feels almost like your own. It was here that a young couple moved into a modest apartment. Their room faced a narrow lane, just wide enough for the occasional scooter to pass. Across from them, another window, curtains yellowed with age, glass clouded but not opaque. The wife was the first to notice it. Every night, at exactly midnight, she would see a figure there, an old woman, long gray hair cascading over her shoulders, her wrinkled face half hidden in shadow, but her eyes never blinked. They were locked on the young wife with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She thought little of it at first, maybe just a lonely old neighbor, unable to sleep. But as nights passed, it became a pattern. Midnight, always midnight. The same window, the same stare, motionless, silent. It unsettled her so deeply that she brought it up to her husband. Yet, whenever he crossed the room and looked out, the window was empty, curtains drawn, no one there. The wife began to dread the nights. She would sit in bed, clutching the blanket, her heart hammering as the clock ticked closer to 12. And without fail, the face would appear, pale, unblinking, watching. Days turned into weeks. The woman's presence was no longer something she could ignore. It began to infect her dreams. She would wake, drenched in sweat, certain she had heard a faint tapping on the glass of her own window. Finally, her fear overpowered her. One afternoon, while her husband was at work, she gathered her courage and walked across the lane. Her hands trembled as she knocked on the door of the opposite apartment. A young man answered. He looked tired, almost startled to see her. She stammered out her question, explaining that she often saw an elderly woman at the window late at night. The moment the words left her lips, the young man's expression changed. His eyes darkened, his jaw clenched. Then in a low voice he said, "That was my mother." The wife let out a nervous laugh of relief until he added quietly, "But she died 2 years ago." Her stomach dropped. A cold shiver rippled down her spine. But the man wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his voice heavy with something between sorrow and fear. She hated being alone. She used to sit at that window for hours, staring at the neighbors, waiting for someone to acknowledge her, even after death. I think she's still waiting, still watching, and she doesn't want to leave. the wife fled back to her own apartment, her hands shaking too hard to fit the key in the door. That night, she locked her windows. She pulled the curtains tight, but it didn't matter. Because just after midnight, she felt it again, that prickling sensation on the back of her neck, that silent pressure of unseen eyes. She didn't dare look, but she knew. Across the narrow alley, in that window cloaked in shadows, someone was still watching. And sometimes, when the wind was very still, she swore she could hear the faint creak of glass, as though the window on the other side was slowly opening. Story 3, The House Next Door. Our final story takes us to a small town in rural Mexico where folklore and reality often blur. In places like this, the old stories are not just entertainment. They are warnings, whispered from one generation to the next. Stories of witches, shapeshifters, and men who made secret pacts in the dead of night. It was here that a family of 4 moved into a modest home. Their new life seemed peaceful at first. Each morning, their elderly neighbor would greet them from across the fence, a quiet, polite man who always raised his hand in a gentle wave. He rarely spoke, but there was something comforting in his presence. But when the sun went down, comfort gave way to unease. At night, the family began to notice strange things. Faint chanting carried on the wind, rhythmic and low, like prayers spoken backward. The smell of incense drifted through the alley, thick, pungent, and cloying. And sometimes, when they peeked from behind their curtains, they swore they saw shadows moving in the old man's yard, not walking, but flickering, as though they belonged to bodies that weren't entirely human. The father dismissed it at first, insisting it was imagination. But one night, shortly after midnight, he awoke to the sound of growling outside his bedroom window. Not the growl of a dog, something deeper, hungrier. He pulled the curtain aside and froze. There, in the yard next door, stood the old man, barefoot in the dirt, his head tilted back, his mouth moving quickly as though reciting words in a language the father couldn't understand. The cadence was hypnotic, guttural, almost inhuman. Behind him, the air seemed to ripple. Outlines of figures shimmered in the darkness, some crouched low to the ground, others towering with long bent limbs. Their shapes were never clear, as if caught between worlds, but their presence was undeniable, and as the father stared, he felt an overwhelming sensation that those shapes were staring back. Terrified, he stumbled away from the window. He didn't sleep until the first rays of dawn cut across the floor. The next morning, the family gathered their courage. Together, they walked to the neighbor's front door, their fists rapped against the wood. No answer. They knocked again. Still nothing. Finally, the father pushed the door open. Inside, the air was stale. Dust coated every surface. Plates still sat on the table, layered in cobwebs. A cracked photograph of the old man rested on the mantel. The date beneath it froze them in place. He had died over a year earlier. Shaken, they rushed outside, demanding answers from other neighbors. That was when the truth came out, spoken only in whispers, as though saying it too loudly would call the shadows back. The old man, they learned, had been a brujo, a practitioner of forbidden rituals. It was said he knew how to call upon spirits to do his bidding, how to slip between the living and the dead. Some believed he had mastered the art of walking beyond death itself, his soul anchored to the land through ancient rites. The family didn't wait to learn more. Within weeks, they packed their belongings and left, abandoning the house and its secrets. To this day, the property remains empty. Locals avoid passing it after dark. They say you can still hear the low hum of chanting behind its walls. Dogs refuse to go near the fence, howling at the shadows, sometimes crawl across the yard, even when the night is still. The house stands silent, but those who live nearby swear that the man never truly left. Because in that town, the dead do not always rest, and some neighbors remain neighbors forever. In each of these stories, one chilling thread connects them all: neighbors who were never what they seemed. In the United States, the horror was human, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monster is flesh and blood. A man who lived in the walls, watching, listening, leaving behind an imprint so strong it still lingers decades later. In India, the fear came from grief left unresolved, a mother's spirit anchored to her window, unable or unwilling to leave the family she once watched over. Her gaze, silent but suffocating, is the kind of haunting born not from malice, but from attachment too strong to sever. And in Mexico, the tale twisted even deeper, rooted in ancient rituals and whispered legends of brujos who walk between the living and the dead. For some, death is not an ending, but a doorway. And when that doorway remains open, neighbors do not rest. They linger. Folklore across cultures warns us of the same truth. Fences, doors, and locks mean nothing. Walls may separate homes, but spirits pass through them like smoke. Secrets bleed across them. And when we ignore the strange noises, the strange sights, or the strange behaviors of those who live beside us, we may be ignoring a warning too late to understand. So, what do you think really happened? Were these tales just paranoia, imagination, grief echoing through thin walls? Or are they proof that death itself doesn't separate us, that the dead can live right beside us, watching, waiting? We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to tell us the city or country you're watching from. And to those who stayed with us until the end, thank you. If you haven't already, subscribe to Voices of Fear, where every week we bring you true encounters with the unknown. By subscribing, you make sure you never miss the next descent into darkness. Next week, we'll take you deeper to encounters darker, stranger, and closer than you think. Until then, stay safe. And remember this: sometimes the most terrifying neighbors are the ones who never truly move away.